Great. Well, thanks, Gary, for joining us for the ASAA's Oral History Project. It's a real pleasure to have you to take part in it. Uh, just as a way of opening proceedings, I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself and describe your expertise for those people who are not so familiar with your work.
I'm a political economist who has an interest in the relationship between politics, society, and economy. And I have a background in social and political theory, broad background in the social sciences. Undergraduate degrees were dabbled quite broadly: anthropology, sociology, politics, bit of history. And then I did an honours degree in social and political theory, by which time I had sort of focused around political economy increasingly. And
Right.
I went on to do the PhD, which is what brought me into the world of Asian studies, but from a perspective theoretically and conceptually of working through political economy approaches.
Great. Oh, thank you. No, it's always interesting to hear how people uh, present themselves and sort of see the various parts of their lives come together in their work. So that's it's good to hear you say that. And I guess because of our focus at ASAA on Asian studies, then uh, could you just elaborate a bit more on that? I said you said it sort of did come to you sort of at PhD level. How would you consider sort of Asia or Asian studies sort of as a part of your life, I suppose?
Well, when I did my PhD, I which was supervised by Richard Roberson, who was a political economist, had done a lot of important work, including writing the book, The Rise of Capital, which was in the context of um, New Order Indonesia and lots of conflicts and difficulties doing research because it was quite authoritarian at that point. But my thesis, what I was proposing to do was to work on the theorisation and the understanding about what was then the emergence of a new international division of labour. And this was a period back in the uh, late 70s, early 80s, when uh, production by manufacturers was being decomposed. So it was the beginning of the deindustrialization of the advanced industrial countries and the increasing investment in generally low value added production processes in various parts of the world, including Asia. And Asia was very important because of the emergence of the new industrializing countries. And there were debates around what was the driver of the rapid economic growth in countries like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and others. And this had become a model. And in the broad debates, there was the ascendant view was that by neoclassical economists was the idea that this showed the power of free markets.
Mm.
This is pretty unsophisticated to me because although I hadn't done any empirical work on Southeast Asia or anywhere for that matter in depth on political economy, I was quite familiar with the debates about the relationship between states and markets and read a lot of theoretical work on that. And so I wanted to concentrate on that debate and try and make a contribution. And my initial PhD project was to look at the extent to which Australian companies or Australian-based companies had gone offshore to Southeast Asia and what would be the implications of this for the manufacturing future of Australia. And I spent the first year in terms of field work going off and interviewing people in Canberra and getting ready to government departments, going to Sydney and Melbourne, various places, interviewing CEOs of Australian-based companies that had participated in this offshore push towards investment in Southeast Asia. And then I followed that up in Southeast Asia And I was initially working on Singapore and Malaysia, did a lot of field work. But I drew the conclusion after that trip that there's something much bigger going on here than Australia's participation in this offshore investment. In fact, it didn't take me long to work out that Australia was as a minnow in this exercise, and the major companies from around the world were Europe, the United States, Japan, were really, the drivers of this investment process. So I came back and had a talk with my supervisor, and I also had come to see that looking at these two countries was going to be probably difficult. And I got intrigued by what was going on, and I thought the best way I can understand this is to understand the politics of the country in which this process is happening. And I narrowed down to Singapore. That was much easier for me because I didn't have any Asian language skills. And so that's what I did. And, I did interview a lot of international companies, their CEOs, and asked them about what motivated them to invest in Singapore. And they were quite dubious about the idea that it was just free markets. I mean, they liked a lot of things. Some of them were quite open and saying that, the fact that they didn't have to deal with pesky unions and be scrutinised by the press, and they could just get on with business. That was pretty attractive to them. But all of them certainly talked about the way in which the state operated in Singapore to smooth the way and reduce the costs for production, that was a big attraction. So that's what the thesis was about. But of course, having spent 3 or 4 years intensely studying what was going on there, interviewing all sorts of people, I came to learn a lot more about the politics of the place. And when I finished my PhD, I took a new turn. I then devoted a lot more time to that and looking at the politics of the place.
Right. No, thank you. Now, I don't think to date you've mentioned it, but I'm so far as I know, you did do your PhD at Murdoch, is that right, in Perth? And could you tell us a little bit about the how it was there? I mean, were you you said you were studying with Richard Robertson as your principal supervisor, if that was the term they used. Were you one of the few people who ended up having a sort of an Asian focus to your work, or was that fairly common across the PhD cohort there at Murdoch at the time?
In the humanities and social sciences, it was very common. In fact, Murdoch was one of the first universities in Australia to set up Asian studies, environmental science, and a few other things, because other universities followed that down the track. But like many of the other post-World War II universities in Australia, there were fields that weren't common, at least in terms of the number of people interested in them at the more traditional universities. And Murdoch had a huge number of people from all different disciplines and theoretical orientations in the humanities and social sciences. And that was reflected in the fact that the Murdoch University was the site for the Asia Research Centre, which was a special centre of the Australian Research Council in those days, and it was awarded in 1991. This was at the peak time in my lifetime. This was the peak period where governments, who of course have great influence over the amount of funds that the Australian Research Council gets, and some say, or some behind the scenes influencing of what sort of priorities might be reflected in the way that funding is used. And there were about 22 universities that put up submissions for that special centre, and it was Murdoch that got that. So I was extremely privileged to be at a place where, one, we had great staff, lots of good staff around Australia at different universities, but we were successful in getting that grant, and that lasted for 9 years. So it was well resourced. It attracted lots of PhD students from Asia. It was a really rich place to be. And having gone into the PhD program knowing very little about Southeast Asia, other than what I'd read in newspapers, to becoming surrounded by huge numbers of experts and people who were actually living in Southeast Asia and just temporarily colleagues, was extremely rich.
Could you tell us a bit more about some of the people who you worked with most closely at the time, or who were doing PhDs with you, even sort of? I guess that was a bit prior to the centre being set up, but
well, Kevin Hewison and I, Kevin went in a year ahead of me. He was working on Thailand, but we had other people who came through. Jane Hutchison working on the Philippines. Fadi Hadiz came before too long. Once we got the Asia Research Centre, he was one of the trailblazers amongst a large number of PhD students. And Fadi was a specialist on Indonesia, and still to this day co-writes with Dick off and on. But there was David Goodman, who was a specialist on China and was the co-applicant with Dick for the Special Research Centre. And lots of people came in and out of the centre who came for short visits. So it'd be too difficult to name them all, and don't want to offend people by suggesting I've just comprehensively listed them. I haven't, but it was rich. There were, the way the centre worked when there were lots of edited books which would bring specialists from the rest of Australia and outside Australia to produce manuscripts that were very inclusive, but also, to be quite clear, had a pretty strong focus on political economy. So that was not the only strength of the centre, but it was one that developed pretty rapidly, and I think has consolidated ever since.
yeah, so it's that centre was certainly sort of really world leading, and certainly one of the best in Australia sort of at that time, and its legacy lives on. What about in terms of say the teaching programs at Murdoch? Was that sort of translating into sort of offerings for, say, at the bachelor's and master's levels too, for students in Asian studies or Asia focused political economy even?
At the undergraduate level, certainly. And the thing about the Asia Research Centre was it wasn't just an Asian studies centre. Whether or not somebody worked in Asian studies or in the discipline of economics or politics or cultural studies, it didn't really matter. They were all members of the Asia Research Centre, and that was its great strength. It was multidisciplinary and in some respects interdisciplinary. But I have to say that one of the things that unfortunately didn't happen, which was an oversight, was that there wasn't an early attempt to translate those expertise into a master's. I think that was a missed opportunity. There was a lot of undergraduate courses across the disciplines that had focus on Asia. But although there were masters in development studies and what have you, it was a missed opportunity. I think that we didn't have a sort of master's course that could be identified as a product of the staff at the Asia Research Centre. There still isn't, to my knowledge, at Murdoch, a course that's just on Asia at the master's level. But on the other hand, and I think this has probably happened at most universities in Australia, the normalisation of Asia is so important across the disciplines. Is I think the strength of the study of Asia, the fact that it's not consolidated as something distinctive or needing special treatment, though obviously in languages that's a sort of special issue, but that in every discipline, if you're really serious about giving students what they need to understand the world, and especially given our closeness to Asia and its importance, then you just have to embed these expertise across the disciplines.
What did you tend to teach, Garry, when you were at Murdoch?
Well, it was probably 15 or 20 years before I taught anything on Asia. When I got my position there, I was teaching introduction to politics. I taught international relations. I simply had to teach what we needed to have taught. And when the staff were, so I went, the first 5 to 10 years, I certainly didn't do anything that directly related to my research. And I actually think that was really good for me. I had a broad base of knowledge about politics and political economy. And it meant that the time that I did have for research, I really cherished it, and time that I spent in Asia. And that I was also always kept on guard by students who would ask questions that I'd leave the lecture thinking, that's something I should be asking about Singapore or Malaysia. So, of course, there were students in my classes who were interested in Asia, and they would, bring topics up and comparisons when we're in tutorials. But the fact that we were discussing this in the context of general theory was always, I think, part of my strength in the way that I came to do my research, that I didn't live in a microcosm of just experts interested in Singapore or Malaysia, for example.
What about at the higher levels? I presume you would have had quite a few PhD students who came to you to want to work with you. Could you tell us about a couple of those? So people who've maybe really enjoyed working with as first a PhD student and maybe later as a co-author or a collaborator on projects of common interest?
Well, Mark Beeson was one of my first. I think Mark was my first PhD student who completed, and Mark is back in Perth after teaching all around the world, teaching in different parts of Australia. And Mark at the time was very interested in political economy and Gramsci, which was something I was very interested in. But he moved more towards sort of international relations. Now he's back in Perth, retired, and he and I are talking more about political economy. So the wheel is turned, sharing ideas on his knowledge of IR theory, comparing it with my positions on political economy. But yeah, there've been a lot. And again, there's the risk of omitting some. But of course, Jane Hutchison, who I finished up supervising her when her initial supervisor retired. She's an expert on the Philippines. Jane has recently retired. She went on to be a colleague of mine at Murdoch. Andrew Brown, similar thing. His initial supervisor was Kevin Hewison. Kevin went abroad and finished up working with Andrew and his work on labour in Thailand. Toby Carroll, who is a political economist, and he carried on along with Shahar Hamiri in taking over the editorship of The Political Economy of Southeast Asia, which was a book series that Kevin Hewison, Richard Roberson and myself ran for 3 volumes. And then the petrol had run dry in the tank. So these guys took over. Shahar Hamiri Toby Carroll and Lee Jones, who's an English academic who was attracted to and is indeed a creative contributor to the sort of political economy that we were promoting. Yeah, and there have been a lot of other people who haven't finished up in academia, some who have in the region, but some have gone on to other careers. I think I've completed 18 or 19 PhD supervisions. And the very interesting point is that none of them have become specialists on Singapore politics.
Well, that's it's good if they're not. Yeah, you're creating new value, adding value to the world rather than really, hewing too closely to what you started with. That's not necessarily not the only thing you know. But that's probably a good segue to put you on the spot a bit and say, could you tell us about a couple of the either books or articles that you're most proud of? I think we're allowed to be proud of things in our life, aren't we? But I mean, if you had to sort of, when you look back of the many things you've done, what have been a couple of the things that you've sort of been most satisfying that you've among your writings?
Well, I guess the one that is the culmination of my work over decades is the 2018 book, which is Participation Without Democracy. And this was published by Cornell University Press. But it has a background that is important and will explain why I get most gratification from this book. And that is that I was fortunate enough, partly because of the Asia Research Centre, but also because of being able to get some ARC money for big projects, ambitious projects. I had a particular conception of a research agenda, which was dependent upon getting, a fair bit of support, which I'm forever grateful to the Australian Research Council for. I'm interested principally in understanding the direction of political regimes, but there are plenty of people who are interested in that, and they have their own theoretical approaches. My particular concern was that in the dominant theoretical approach to understanding political institutions in Southeast Asia was one that eschewed political economy rather than embraced it. So in 2007, in conjunction with Kanishka Jayasuriya, we developed a project on participation, different forms of participation and modes of participation in Southeast Asia. And in that, we were trying to challenge institutionalist ideas or institutional analyses that were really preoccupied with this question. Are regimes in Southeast Asia or anywhere becoming more or less democratic? And that sort of only gets you so far. And you can categorise and come up with typologies of different deviations from democracy amongst what I would generally call authoritarian regimes in the region. What was being missed in all of this, I thought, was we're ending up finding out what a lot of regimes aren't, but we're not finding out what they are. So I thought the way ahead would be to look at transparency, at accountability, at participation, at representation, all institutions that are core to any political regime, and come up with a theoretical framework that could be equally applied to all of those without predisposing it towards, is it democratic or not? Is it authoritarian or not? I just want to find out what it is. And I thought we need to get to that point. So that's what I did. And Kanishka and I did that project in 2007. And that was hugely helpful for me. Kanishka's a fantastic person to work with, but also we brought in other people who were, signing up for this sort of thing. And after that, I followed this up with a dedicated book comparing Singapore and Malaysia on transparency. It was transparency and authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. And then I teamed up with Caroline Hughes, who I was very fortunate to have as a colleague at Murdoch University for, I can't remember, 4 or 5 years, very productive years, and hugely enjoyable working with Caroline on that. And that was looking at accountability, scrutinising accountability, and various other, smaller projects. But then in 2018, I published this book, which really was much more ambitious and tried to bring all this together by expounding this theory of modes of participation. So it was submitted as a framework for understanding political regimes in general that was not biased, but had concepts and frameworks that could be used to look at political regimes with a more open mind.
And I must say, I had the pleasure to hear you launch that book. I think just before we started recording today, I think you launched it the aid of Ed Aspinall in 2018 at the ASAA conference. So I think it's been very well received and great value to ASAA, not just in an Asian context, but elsewhere too. Speaking of, I suppose, the ASAA, I was wondering if you could tell us about sort of what involvement you've had, it's sort of in whether it be at the conference level or any other sort of involvement in the life of ASAA over time.
ASAA biennial conferences were, for me, absolutely essential and greatly valued. And that's been my main involvement, and for a whole range of reasons. The first reason was being in Western Australia, it's the best opportunity to meet colleagues who work on Asia, not just on the stuff that I worked on, which there are many valued colleagues around Australia, and to get great feedback from them and constructive criticisms when you present your own work, but also to learn about other people and what they're doing. It's not in your face like it is with your own colleagues in your own institution. But as well as that, it's a great forum with a critical mass of other people who generally are facing the same challenges and issues that you face in your institution, diminishing funding, restructuring of universities, uncertain future of your organisational unit in most cases if you hadn't already been restructured, not knowing whether you'll be restructured again in the foreseeable future. Mm. So it was good for morale, and it was always great to be amongst people where you could not only lament the challenges, but also discuss what might be some of the practical solutions to this and share experiences of things that might have worked in another institution. So, yeah, I always valued that, and it was intellectually rewarding, but it was also a source of good morale and new insights of things that are bigger than just your research.
Yes, no, thank you. And I guess you've alluded to the fact that you are, you've never been, situated or even necessarily identified in Asian studies per se, in the same way as some people might be if they're in a position where they're teaching language and area studies sort of as such. But you also have a sort of interesting vantage point on it because of that, because you're able to sort of see it from half a step removed or something. So I was wondering if you could sort of give us a little bit of a sense of how you think Asian studies has progressed or regressed or whatever, or tracked over time, sort of in the last decade or two.
Mm. I think its diversity is immensely impressive. When I think about Australian scholars who work in the field, And you don't have to reflect for too long to think that it's not accidental. I mean, we live in this region, uh, surrounded by such diverse, interesting range of countries. And that's why, for me, it was such a great laboratory because, there's authoritarian, democratic regimes as well as, mass movements that have come and gone. A lot of change in my time. It's not a static place. So it was brilliant. But I think that over time, I mean, I haven't closely examined all institutions, but when I go to have been to conferences, and certainly I've seen a flourishing of research done by people across every discipline. So that's the plus side against the negative of the change that's happened, which afflicts all the humanities and social sciences areas of diminished funding, diminished importance attached to it by the people that dish out the money for universities. And I worry too about it's not just the reduced funding, it's also that the shift in funding. It used to be in my field that ambitious research, which is for the collective good, which is not instrumental or driven by immediate benefits for some business area or government policy, but doing work that sets the context for all of those things. That increasingly, as Australian Research Council open competitive funding diminishes, there is often, with less bureaucracy involved and more money, opportunities through various government departments to get money that might be security oriented or more economically oriented. And even the ARC itself now, I think, is much more attentive to, probably necessarily so, because of the pressures exerted on it from the funders of the ARC, that things have to have more instrumental value. So it's more challenging than when I was, at the centre of my career. It's not as supportive for the things that I did. I worry about that. And it's reinforced in universities where managers are putting expectations on scholars, especially at a very young, early start of their career, to be bringing in money. And this has the potential, and in some cases the reality, of diverting career trajectories towards a greater dependence upon funding, where instead of you defining the research project, it's defined for you. And if you want the money, climb on board. If you don't, oh, well, go and do your own thing. So that concerns me. It's a problem that affects Asia, the study of Asia, but it's a problem that affects all of the humanities and social sciences. And I think I don't have any ready solution, or I would be sharing it with everybody that I could. But it does seem to me that we need to act collectively, and we need stronger leadership from universities at the table with the policymakers. And we have too many divisions at that level, with too many areas of broken up into different categories of universities. And that doesn't work for the majority of universities, and I don't think it works for any, actually, because you end up with less variety and quality across the various disciplines.
No, that's well put, I think. And as you say, if the solutions were near to hand, we would have jumped on them by now, you'd think. Uh, if we could just sort of finish, I suppose, I note everything you've said about the pressures and the conditionality, if you will, attached to some of the funding streams from ARC and the like. be that as it may, I wonder what you would say. What sort of what makes you optimistic in terms of the research agenda for Asia focused research? Where's what do you see as the energy or the most exciting sort of topics, and where are people doing the best work and that you find most interesting at the moment?
Well, look, I think the serious scholars will find a way to push on. Maybe not at the same scale that they would have otherwise. I see no shortage across all the disciplines of people that work on Asia. Um, there's no diminution in talent. There's no
Mm,
diminution in seriousness about this work. And the things that most people are dealing with, if they're pressing now, they're almost certainly going to be more pressing in the future. And the potential and necessity of people to do work on things like energy transitions and trying to manage and avoid conflict in the region as superpowers fight it out for um, greater influence. Uh, these are so profoundly important that it's irrepressible. People will work on these. They are working on these. And I mean, in the area that I work in, I'm mostly interested in and know most about, of course, is political economy. Just on this question of, superpower rivalry. Of course, we know that Asian countries are very nervous about this, in Southeast Asia in particular, and the stated position of governments is most governments in ASEAN is that that they want to avoid siding with US or China, but they want to work cooperatively with everyone. But there are people in political economy that some of whom I talked about before, young Australians in particular, in collaboration with some outside of Australia, are doing research on things like electric vehicle manufacture and battery manufacture in the region, and showing that this idea of hedging doesn't hold up well to the scrutiny of what's going on the ground. And if you look at the ways in which the various coalitions of interest are translating official statements by governments, including in places like Indonesia, especially in Indonesia, into ones that are resulting in outcomes that necessarily lock countries into supply chains with China, for example, with a particular bias towards certain sorts of activities that can't help but go unnoticed by the United States that are concerned about these things. So this is a very fertile area where, as I see, a lot of work, but there would be equivalence to this going on, maybe not in political economy or on that particular issue. And I guess something that we probably have to be mindful of is, historically speaking, I was really fortuitous to have gone into academia at the time that I did. And the ARC was giving out all this money and we could compete for that. But the vast majority of people who've worked in universities over the last century, they didn't have dedicated research funding,
mm,
didn't have the teaching
mm,
loads, to be fair either.
mm,
But it's the quality of research and what you produce rather than the quantity. So if people can slow down and stop trying to set world records for the number of publications they churn out in a year and think more about progressing an idea to the maximum that it can be done by sharing your manuscripts, aiming high, and a handful of well thought out, properly scrutinised articles that hit the mark will have more impact on your reputation and career than 50 articles that aren't saying much at all. So
mm.
I think, and maybe you might even have a better lifestyle because you're not working the hours needed to set those world records.
Garry, I think that's really great advice to that we slow down, we focus on the quality, uh, fit it within the realities of a different university landscape. As you say, we're pulled in many different directions, and yes, maybe adjusting to an era when there's sort of a bit less generous support from sources such as the ARC. Uh, Thank you again for your contribution. I really enjoyed having the chance to talk to you about what you've done with your career, and I think everyone's going to enjoy having the chance to learn from you.
My
Thanks, Garry.
pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.